Hi, Terrell.
Can you hear me, Robert?
Oh, yes, I can hear you now.
Okay.
Although
And
I can't see you, so
you can?
no, I can't. It's just back.
You say
I cannot.
you cannot see me.
Correct.
Why not?
I don't know. Maybe it's a problem with the camera you're using.
Excuse
I don't have like
me.
spiritual eyes at the moment.
Okay, 14. Oh, that's why, because I turned on my iPhone camera. How do I turn on just my computer camera? FaceTime AD camera. Is this the one? Does
There
that
you
work?
go. That's perfect.
Yeah.
And I
You
love
can
the
tell I
books in
don't
the
do a lot of
background.
things.
Oh no, no. Well, before we like begin properly, I know you probably get loads of like requests to come on to like various podcasts, so I really do appreciate you taking the time. As I said, I'm actually friends with Nathaniel, so he can vouch that I'm just saying.
Yeah, yeah, he did.
Oh, good, good. So how are you keeping?
Pretty well. Pretty well. Where are you located?
Oh, holiday. I'm originally from Ireland, as you probably know, but I moved here for the B.H. Roberts Foundation. So I've been here
Oh,
for like a year now in Utah.
okay. So Holiday, Utah. I
That's
have.
correct, yes.
Oh, yeah, I have been there. I've been to the famous home that I'm sure you'd know it if I could remember the name. It's a historic home that's 19th century restored to its full splendor. Um, it's like a living museum. Anyhow, yeah, I've been to Holiday, so I know that area briefly. It's kind of a suburb of Salt Lake, right?
Oh, that's correct. It's only like, yeah, not too far away from Salt Lake itself. And it's not too far away, like maybe only 40 minutes drive or so to Provo. So it's
Right.
pretty accessible. It's nice as well. And yeah, it's a really nice area to live in as well. So it's good.
Good.
And I noticed like a number of the books you have like Raymond Brown, N.T. Wright, and J.P. Meyer and others. So I do look forward to discussing like some aspects of the early Christian theology with you now. How long do you have?
Yeah, I have up to an hour.
Oh no, that's perfect. So what we'll do is like maybe just like hit on like say some points that you're studying in terms of say your great apostasy study and stuff like that. And yeah, so but we'll have like an introduction to you so you can actually plug some of your books. But yeah, that's good. If
Okay.
you want to, so what I'll do is like I'll just record this on the cloud just in case there's an issue, and we can start when you want to. Before you begin, do you have anything to drink just in case you get parched?
No, I'm fine. Thanks.
Okay, that's good. Well, if that's the case, we'll just like start recording now. Well, welcome to another episode of the Scriptural Mormonism Podcast, episode number 49. I'm your host, Robert Ballin. We have a very special guest today, Terryl Givens. I think everyone knows him. But before we begin, just one announcement. Next week, in a few weeks' time, we will actually have my friend Tark Givens on to discuss the A and B theory of time. And as you know, Tark's a determinist, I'm an open theist. So it'll be a very interesting exchange between the two of us about that. So be on the outlook for that. And Jeff Lindsay will be joining me sometime in February, hopefully, to discuss Book of Mormon evidences and historicity as well. So because time of the essence, Terrell has given us about an hour of his time this Friday evening. So Terrell, thanks again for coming on to this podcast. I really do appreciate it.
Happy to be here. Thanks.
I think like absolutely everyone knows who you are, but just in case they don't, want to give like a brief overview of your good self. Like, have you always been a Latter-day Saint? What's your educational background, and what got you interested in early Christian theology, which we'll be focusing briefly on today?
Okay. Yeah, my background educationally was intellectual history and comparative literature uh, at Cornell, at Chapel Hill, at BYU. And my specialty was really 19th century intersections of literature and theology or literature and religion. And I never anticipated for a moment taking the career path that has brought me where I am today. But I kind of fell into Mormon studies when I was a professor of literature and religion at the University of Richmond in Virginia, where I was for 30 years. And I just suddenly found this kind of opening there in trying to present Latter-day Saint culture and history, scripture and theology to an academic audience. And so I was fortunate enough to find an outlet for much of my work at Oxford University Press. So for many years, I was just doing kind of the academic end of Latter-day Saint studies. And then back in 2012, or a year or two before that, at the height of kind of media interest in Mormonism because of the Romney campaign, Fiona and I were asked to write a book for a general audience on the church. And so that was when we wrote The God Who Weeps, which we thought we were writing for a general audience. It ended up actually kind of finding a receptive audience within the Latter-day Saint community. Excuse me. So from that time to the present, I've kind of split my labors between academic treatments and saints-facing treatments of the Latter-day Saint faith. And then, something interesting happened about 3 years ago. I guess I was just growing increasingly cognizant of the fact that Latter-day Saints, much of our theology intersects with a great number of contemporary conversations in ways that weren't true in the 19th century. In other words, there are a lot of things that are making a comeback in Christian conversations that have always been a part of a Latter-day Saint tradition, like the passibility of God, a weeping God, post-mortal salvation, the new perspectives on Paul movement, which is suddenly reappraising, how we've understood the whole kind of Protestant reading of Paul. Theosis is now on everyone's lips. And so it occurred to me, we should really be participating in these conversations, but I don't see that we are anywhere. And so I asked my editor at Oxford if she'd be interested in my doing a book on the history of Christianity written from a Latter-day Saint point of view to try to, engender a kind of conversation, dialogue in this regard. And she said, "Oh, yeah, we'd love to do that. That sounds terrific. Go ahead and send your proposal in." And then I thought about it, and in ensuing days, I said, I don't want to be red flagging this as a Latter-day Saint perspective. It's too easy to ghettoize Latter-day Saints from the conversation as it is. And she said, "Oh, well, then I'm not sure we're interested." And that was kind of the moment when I realized that, in some ways, not every way, but in some ways, we're kind of pursuing a cul-de-sac with Mormon studies, because we're largely speaking to other Latter-day Saints. And I think we have thought that we had been integrated into larger conversations. And for the most part, we're still kind of in our own little place in the sandbox doing our thing. And so it was from that moment a couple of years ago when I decided, no, I really want to do Christian studies. I want to be doing Christian history and Christian theology. And as a Latter-day Saint, I bring a unique perspective, but I'm part of a Christian community, and I would like to see more Latter-day Saints that are kind of invited into the public square in ways that I hope open up in the future. So that brings me right down to the present moment.
Well, thanks for that background. And by the way, everyone should actually check out Terrell's books, especially for this year on the Book of Mormon, By the Hand of Mormon, the American Scripture to Launch a New World Religion. I actually read that book a couple months even before I got baptized, almost 19 years ago now. It's a very good book.
Thank you.
And of course, like your works in say Latter-day Saint history, like Resting the Angel and Feeding the Flock, they're much better than a certain book that came out a few years previously that tried to give the history of LDS doctrine. I'm not going to name names, but you know what I'm talking about. But that was me. I'm kind of, when I found out like you were doing like studies into say early Christianity and Latter-day Saint theology and worldviews with respect to say contemporary and historical views, I was really interested because like you're good at intellectual history. I think even your critics would admit that. And there's so many areas we could like delve into. Like I know Latter-day Saints, like my friend Blake Oster, has been invited to speak on open theism and other topics with John Sanders and others. There's Thomas J. Ord. You may have heard of him from the Church of Nazarene. We're Facebook friends. He really likes a lot of our views on like creation. He doesn't believe in Cratio ex nihilo. He's an open theist like I am, although he's more pro-cis theology. So like there is like some areas, especially like my friend Joseph Lowell, and to some extent Tarek Lecor has done work on like the problems with absolute divine simplicity and our view of materiality. And I think they've done really good stuff. But for you specifically, what area or areas, because there's so much we could focus on, do you think are like the most pertinent and most important? And or maybe like an area or two that you think like have been understudied or underappreciated by Latter-day Saints?
Yeah, let me tell an anecdote, I think, to answer that question. And I've talked about this before, so this may be familiar to some listeners. But when Andrew Teal, who is a chaplain and a lecturer in theology at Pembroke College, Oxford, he's become over the last 3 or 4 years very good friends with Elder Holland and other Latter-day Saints. And because of his efforts to create more bridges between his own Anglican community and Latter-day Saints, he was awarded an honorary doctorate last April by Brigham Young University. And at the time of his visit, I was asked by BYU if I would host him for the week that he was here. So one of the early evenings that he was here, we were having dinner together. And I said, Andrew, you know, it's well known that you're good friends with Elder Holland. You have very kind, generous feelings about Latter-day Saints and our teachings. And I said, but I'm curious, what was the hook, other than just personal connections? What was the hook in our doctrine or our teachings or theology that aroused your interest and your sympathies? And without pausing, he just instantly said, oh, the Cappadocian Fathers. And not a term that's familiar, you know, to most people in our conversation. And Cappadocian Fathers, right, are a group of 4th century church fathers from today's central Turkey, Cappadocia. And they're most famous today for the contributions to the Trinitarian development, just right around the time of Nicaea. But I knew that's not what he was referring to. And I said, are you telling me that you heard their theology of ascent channeled through Joseph Smith? And he said, yes, that's exactly what I mean. And so to me, this is a terribly exciting kind of point of entry into reassessing the Christian past and how Latter-day Saints would see the Christian developments as getting a little bit derailed by Augustinian developments that substituted other paradigms for what until that moment was largely this incredibly beautiful construct called the Theology of Ascent. And it didn't originate with the Cappadocian Fathers. We find this in Irenaeus earlier. We find it in Origen. And what I mean by this is people like Irenaeus believed, and Origen believed, that this world was what they called a school for souls. So if you ask the question, why did God create the world, right? There's an incredibly large number of people who there's an absolute consensus on this, going back to Tertullian all the way to John Piper and Rick Warren today. And they will all say the same thing. Oh, he created us for his glory. He loves his glory above all else. And I've never understood why that doesn't strike most people as just kind of a supreme narcissism. But if you'd asked Origen that question, he would say, well, God wanted peers. He wanted companionship of souls that had achieved the kind of nature and divinity possessed by him. And so he created this world as this school for souls. And so accordingly, when Irenaeus assesses what happens in the Garden of Eden, he insists that this was not some catastrophe. It was not this great crime. It was a minor digression along this educational path towards a kind of divinization, a path that all humans are embarked upon. And so the Cappadocians just developed that idea to kind of the furthest extent, that we are all here climbing this ladder, a ladder of ascent, a ladder towards God. Everything that we experience is formative and educational. Sin is collateral damage that occurs along the way. And I find just beautiful resonance, right? Obviously, with Latter-day Saint concepts of eternal progress and divinization. And so a lot of my work has tried to assess, well, how did we lose sight of that paradigm? How is it slowly kind of infiltrating back into Christian thought in a lot of ways and through a lot of voices?
Oh, no, thanks for that. And I'm glad I'm not the only Latter-day Saint who knows who Origen is. And before anyone says, well, Origen was condemned as a heretic, he was at the Fifth Ecumenical Council, but it's like 299 years after he's dead.
Right.
So I cope and see it. So like you kind of mentioned Origen and Irenaeus, and I'm sure like in your studies of their writings, like against heresies and other works, there's also a rejection, like say a lot of the Augustinian understandings and later Reformed or Calvinistic understandings of the nature of man and the nature of the atonement. Like the idea of say the atonement was not a penal substitution, where God's wrath was poured out in the legalistic manner on Christ and so forth, but instead it was a recapitulation, that is an undoing and restoring to the Edenic ideal, if you will, of humanity and of the earth. Do you believe that there's any movement in terms of say mainstream theology on that view, and like any resonance, if you will, with Latter-day Saint theology and worldview as well?
Yeah, and there's been a growing discontent with Anselmian models of atonement theology. So just to quickly recapitulate your main point. It's not until the Middle Ages that we develop something that today we would recognize as atonement theology, right? Satisfaction theology developed by Anselm, later by the Reformers, that morphs into a kind of penal substitution. And I consider Hastings Rashtel, he's this just titanic 19th century theologian who writes just a devastating critique of that whole tradition of substitutionary and satisfaction theory. And following in his wake, at the present moment, there are all kinds of theologians who, especially feminists and womanists and Black theologians, all who are saying, this penal substitutive model has really worked to the detriment of all kinds of oppressed and marginalized peoples if we privilege suffering and vicarious expiation as inherently this godly kind of thing. It isn't healthy for any number of reasons, both because what it says about the nature of God and retribution, and because of the misleading directions it can point toward for people who are suffering and oppressed. And so Abelard is generally considered the father of what today we call moral influence theology, which was a reaction against Anselm, right? Abelard, the famous monk who emasculated because of his marriage to Eloise. His argument was, look, we're not in bondage to the devil. He doesn't own us. Christ doesn't need to ransom us. We belong to whomever we love. And beholding Christ's absolute selflessness with which he led his life and gave it at the end, something in our hard shell cracks. And in his language, love is kindled in us in a way that we begin to heal and we begin to redirect ourselves toward a godly path. Abelard isn't the first to think of atonement in those ways. I think that's very close to how Irenaeus understood atonement. I think one of the great tragedies of Western theology is illuminated in this wonderful moment in 1 Nephi 11, right? When we get this vision of the tree of life, in which Nephi is beholding what his father saw, but with right further articulation and explanation. And he asks about the meaning of the tree of life, of course, and it's accompanied by this question the angel asks him. And he says, do you know the condescension of God? Now, as Latter-day Saints, it seems to me we should sit up at this point and take notice and ask, why didn't he say, do you understand the atonement of God? Atonement is a word, as far as I can tell, Joseph Smith never even used. For the early Christians, the resurrection was enormously significant, but incarnation was the focus of sermonizing. It's the focus of Peter's sermons, right? In Acts, it's the beginning all the way back in the 4th century when Athanasius writes a book called Why God Incarnate, right? Cur Deus Homo. Why did God become man? And the answer is, well, he became incarnate to model a kind of life and to teach a certain set of values and teaching, to inspire us in a certain direction. And his life culminates in this death. But the sacrificial death is just, right, the end point on a total incarnation that is restorative and healing and edifying and inspiring and all these other things. And so I think it's very sad that what happens with Anselm is that the entire beauty, the totality of this incarnation gets contracted into just this one moment of death. and something magical happens there called atonement. And I think that just sells us very, very short.
No, I appreciate that. I recently reread the collected works of Anselm, 12th century Catholic theologian, for those listening in who are not nerds like we are. And it's going to be known by some Eastern Orthodox that the problem with like a lot of Western theology is you start with soteriology and then you go to Christology.
Right.
But that's the wrong way. If you look at against heresies by Irenaeus and others, they always begin first with Christology, the incarnation, God, the second member of the Godhead, becoming man so that we can become divinized, regardless of one's theology or theosis here. So that kind of shows like salvation is not simply a legal declaration like reformers believed in, where like you were simultaneously just but a sinner at the same time. You know, although Luther probably never said it fits his theology. By nature, you're power manure, but you're covered, but not transformed by Christ's perfect righteousness. And fortunately, like what I will admit, I'm rather critical of Wright and Dunn when it comes to the new perspective, but I think they're correct in saying the Protestant reformers read Paul in a horrible way.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
E.P. Sanders, right? I love what he says, about
Paul and Palestine in Judaism.
Yeah, exactly, which I think is a monumental achievement. But the notion that if you'd said to a Jew, "Have you been saved?" the Jew would have said, "What?" I mean, that's not even a coherent question as filtered through a kind of Protestant lens, especially. And there's another terrific book. I'm not going to remember the name of it, but it's an early history of sin and early history. And this I think this incredibly productive insight. The author documents how in early Judaism, sin was most generally associated with the notion of burden. The metaphor for sin is burden. We're weighed down by this burden. And so if you ask, what is our innate response to somebody that's bearing a burden, right? The response is, well, we want to lift it or share it or alleviate it. But in Second Temple Judaism, one can track through the Jewish literature the morphing of that metaphor into debt. And so suddenly we shift from a concept of sin as something that needs to be healed, where we need to be redirected, we need to be reconciled, to something that we owe, something for which we have to pay, something for which penance has to be instituted. And so that, of course, eventuates in these atonement theologies that emphasize legalism and justice, right? And repayment that is necessary. And so I think that's another really good explanation for the kind of etiology of this, what I think are really, really pernicious notions associated with atonement as retributive.
Yeah, it also doesn't really make sense, like say Christ's intercessory work that you read about in the scriptures. It's like, well, if it was the legal payment, it was done and dusted on the cross or at the resurrection. What's the purpose of his intercession? And if you look at, say, even just the New Testament, Christ is an ongoing advocate, and that's the basis for then future forgiveness of sins. It doesn't really make sense of penal substitution. But also just on the Christological transformative aspect, Paul, who I think he's butchered by Protestants historically, he understands like the ordinances or the sacraments, to borrow that terminology, to be not just transformative, but also are being united to Christ in a real participatory way. Right. He seems to understand the atonement as a participation, and that's how the atonement should be understood. You mentioned Hastings Rashtal, and there's been a number of other theologians who have moved away from the purely forensic or legal model of atonement to understand like this does injustice to God. It doesn't make sense of the scriptural text. It doesn't make sense of the Second Temple intertestamental period, and even like say the animal sacrifices are not penal in the Old Testament. In fact, if they were penal, it doesn't make sense of Hebrews, for instance. Fortunately, there's been a lot of scholarship. And although I disagree with his model of atonement, sorry, Blake, if you listen to this, I think like Blake Oster's done a very good job at critiquing philosophically the problems when it comes to like traditional models of penal substitution. There's I think he's more of a four-pine Calvinist, but have you ever heard of a Reformed theologian called Oliver Crisp?
Yeah, I'm just finishing up his book right now, Participation and Atonement.
Yeah. He's trying to like argue for like a non-penal substitutionary model of atonement, and there's like fair dues to him, but like
I love
soteriology to deal with.
Yeah, I love his motives, right?
Yes.
He's trying what he calls a minimalist theology, right? He's trying to recuperate what he thinks is salvageable from Anselm, but I don't think it works. I don't think it works. I don't think one can get away from the fact that Anselm and all substitutionary models are, I mean, they very explicitly, right, make merit the criterion of salvation. And the only arguments that are going on in the medieval church are how is merit accrued? Is it through works, or is it imputed by God, or is it restituted by Christ? And but we associate supererogation just with Catholic sales of indulgences, but that notion of supererogation is at the heart of almost all atonement theologies that are based on satisfaction or penal substitution. And here again is why I just wish Latter-day Saints were more uncomfortable with these models, because we have such a radically different understanding of salvation. It's not something that is that can be bought or purchased or awarded or given as part of a transaction. But that's why I keep going back to this theology of ascent, which sees salvation as the culmination of this transformation, right, that schools us and educates us in living the life God is living.
Yeah, and I studied theology in Maynooth, so I remember learning about covenantal nomism a la the New Perspective. It's like, oh, this really fits well with LDS theology. Even some critics, just as J.P. Holding, who wrote a book critiquing Mormon apologetics called The Mormon Defenders, he basically had the intellectual honesty to admit Mormons are not Pelagians or semi-Pelagians. They don't believe you can work your way to heaven. Instead, it would be proper, and I think he's correct. Latter-day Saint theology is basically covenantal nomism. You enter the covenant through baptism, but your good works, although God can reward you because of them, they're not the basis of any boasting or your salvation, or in a legal sense, you can merit it. It's just like how you remain in the covenant, if you will, but it's still ultimately through the instrumental means of God's grace. And it's like, yeah, that's a very fair assessment from a critic of the church.
Yeah, I don't think he's far off.
No, credit to him. I kind of wish more critics were as honest as he was. But that's, I think, a very good area where our theology, even if N.T. Wright and others don't really get it, it's very Latter-day Saint in many respects. And I don't think a lot of our people unfortunately get it as well, because although I'm from a Catholic country, even the Catholic converts think in very Protestant ways in Ireland. And I think a lot of Latter-day Saints are very Protestant in their assumptions when it comes to certain theological aspects as well. And perhaps you're you've seen it as well in Virginia and now in Utah as well. So,
yeah. But
I think once we I don't like using this term, but deprogram that from us, we'll have a better precision of how moving our theologies in all areas. So that's anything else you want to say about that particular aspect?
No, just I guess I would just point this out that I did a word search of General Conference addresses from the 19th century to the present, because I was curious about a couple of terms in particular. And if one does a search for healing or wound, one finds there's been over a 500% increase in the use of those words in General Conference addresses in this present decade. And I celebrate that as a particularly healthy development, because it seems that does represent not just a tonal shift, but a substantive shift away from sin as always construed in terms of a kind of fungible debt to a wound to our nature that needs healing and seeing reconciliation in terms of those kinds of concepts rather than monetary indebtedness. I think is a very healthy thing.
Yeah, and that kind of fits again with the recapitulation theory that you find in early Christianity, like Origen and Irenaeus against heresies. Because one of my main areas of research, I'm not sure if you noticed, is actually Mariology. There's not that many Latter-day Saints who didn't work in that. And although they did not believe in, say, the Immaculate Conception, they did believe Mary was a second Eve, like Irenaeus and others, because of her participation in the incarnation, her saying yes to God and so forth. You can see this in Book 3 of Against Heresies, how Irenaeus likened her to Eve, but Eve, who said yes to a fallen angel, brought about condemnation. Mary unloosed the knot of Eve's disobedience through her fiat, her free will. So you even see this in the Mariology and not just the Christology of early Christianity as well.
Right.
And just on the issue of imputation, I think that's a ghastly doctrine for a number of reasons. First of all, it makes God a liar. I think the Council of Trent was correct when they condemned it, because it basically means God is declaring legally something to be righteous, when in reality it's not. It's like if I had a gold-plated coin, and said like, Terryl, this is pure gold, although I infallibly know it's not pure gold. I mean, it's divine deception and it's legal fiction. And there's a number of host of other issues as well. The idea like you can never lose your salvation, justification is purely external and it's extrinsic and it's static as well. It's very problematic. But unfortunately, I've seen like some Latter-day Saints, including some authors, I'm not going to name names, who have like this very penal substitutionary imputed righteousness view and think like our theology can be married with that of, say, John MacArthur, for instance. And I think it's like, no, I'm sorry,
No.
but no, that you can't.
No, you're absolutely right. I have heard, certain well-known persons within the Latter-day Saint community who have said in public settings, I am saved by Christ's righteousness, not by mine. I think not knowing that they're quoting Luther, and they're quoting Luther's doctrine of imputed righteousness.
Yeah. Now, there is a way Latter-day Saints can say this, but how it's traditionally been understood is like it's an justistia alien nos. It's a righteousness alien to us.
Right.
And it doesn't transform us. There's no real participation. That's only when the realm of sanctification, processive sanctification, even at that. And there's no real room, although Luther tried for, like, say, ordinances and so forth, if you have this very forensic penal view of justification, atonement, and also a very poor view of anthropology as well. Basically, we're totally depraved.
Yeah. And I, my personal belief is that when the Book of Mormon, when we read that we are saved from our sins, not in our sins, I think that's a sly allusion to imputed righteousness.
I agree.
I think it's absolutely resonant with the debates of the 19th century.
Yeah, I agree. And as I say, like, I'm not going to name names, but I think you know who I'm talking about, like, have said in their books, oh yeah, John MacArthur is correct. Well, when it comes to justification and atonement, it's like, no, I'm sorry. I'm not saying you're going to agree with this, but like my friend Blake Oster has said this once, and I agree completely with him. The God of Calvinism is basically the Satan of Mormonism. And I'm not a fan of Reformed theology. So I'm kind of glad there's a number of people who agree with me that we should be moving away from those kind of presuppositions.
Yeah.
Okay, so is there any other topic you want to discuss? Because like I do have like one or two ideas when say the Cappadocians and early Christianity and some things that I think have been overlooked by some Latter-day Saints. So
no, I'd like to hear what you have to say.
Oh yeah, sure. I think I hit this idea off you like in an email, but like the nature of divine simplicity. I'm not sure if you've actually studied that as of yet.
I have not delved into that now. I mean,
okay,
I'm agree with the topic.
Well, yeah, like there's like in the East and West, for instance, they do believe like God by his nature has no parts. Like, yes, the incarnation took place, but there's like two distinct natures. But like God, in terms of his being, there's no parts, there's no passions, and so forth. But like in the Latin West, and this would later become a dogma at the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, the same council that would elevate as a dogma transubstantiation, creation of nothing, and funny enough, Satan as well. They agree with Peter Lombard's view of the nature of divine simplicity. Basically, there's no real distinction between the energies of God and his essence. That is, in the Eastern Orthodoxy, you can say like, yeah, God's simple, but there is a distinction between like his omnipotence and his omniscience and his creative acts. But like in the view of Aquinas, who would put this on steroids, and the Fourth Lateran Council in Lombard, there's no real distinction. There's no real distinction between like God's one of his attributes, like say his omnipotence or his omniscience or his creative acts. And Augustine actually held to this view. Like if you read his works on the Trinity or like the works of Aquinas, those pre-mortal appearances of the angel Yahweh or what many would believe to be the pre-incarnate Christ, they're actually not the second person of the Trinity. They're actually created angelic manifestations or avatars of not only are temporal creations trying to manifest themselves in the world. It kind of leads like a lot of absurdity as well. And if you believe in the filioque clause, as is properly understood, that kind of leads to issues as well. So I kind of noticed like there's a lot of theologians these days who have been moving away from this. There's one, he's a philosopher, but Ryan T. Mullins, if you've ever heard of him.
Don't know him.
Oh no, he teaches in Finland, but he's written books against like God being completely outside of time. He's written quite a bit against divine simplicity. He's kind of shown like when it comes to say the philosophical coherence of this, it's very problematic. In fact, the idea. Oh, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say this is one reason why I'm really a great fan of a lot of what Nicholas Walterstorff has written. I don't know if you know him. He just recently retired as a a professor of philosophy of religion at Yale. And his most famous essay probably is an essay he wrote called God is Everlasting. And he considers himself part of a I think kind of a moderate reformed tradition, but he has no problem calling out what he thinks are some of the absurdities of classical theology. And one of them is the atemporality of God, right? Yep. He says God has to be a kind of jack in the box, that every time he interacts with a human, suddenly he enters into a temporal continuum, and then he exits the temporal continuum. And he says that's just silly.
It's like Star Trek.
Yeah. So this isn't maybe a direct segue from what you're saying about divine simplicity, but one of the dichotomies that I'm working with, of course, all dichotomies are a little reductive, but it seems to me that one way of thinking about two diverse strands in Christian theology and accounting for the way in which theology develops as it has, I make a differentiation between what I call the Johannine God and the Anselmian God. And what I mean by that, and it's a lot of it has to do with how you interpret kenosis, right? When God takes the form of the servant in Philippians, is God divesting himself of his true nature, or is he for the first time fully revealing that true nature? And I take John to be saying repeatedly in the gospel as well as in the letters that no, God is never more God than when he washes his disciples' feet. God is love. In the sense that is his actual mode of being. And everything that we can say about God has to be understood under that umbrella term of divine love. Whereas Anselm defines God as, this a kind of compendium of perfections that all, meet in perfect resolution and synthesis and harmony. So one might argue that God is simple, but in effect, we have to mediate between love and justice and all of these divine attributes. And I think that's what gets us into trouble with atonement theology as well. When we get to Calvin, for example, it's clear that sovereignty has precedence in this catalog of divine attributes. And if something has to give way, it's going to be love, as we understand love. And so for me, that's just been a kind of a useful heuristic for thinking about how one can arrive at a place where, infants meet with general damnation, or, there's vengeance or retribution. If one is foregrounding other attributes of the divine nature on a par with or above love, then it seems to me that we've misread the nature of God.
Yeah, I agree. I'm sure you've read at least some of the institutes and some of the Reformed confessions. And
oh yes,
yeah, my sympathy. But it's like if you read, I think it's in book 3 of the institutes, and you see this in, say, the Westminster and other confessions. God is so sovereign; he's basically impotent. I mean, he has to control everything, including the instrumental causes of everything. I did like what Zwingli once said, and he was honest. In such a worldview, God is the sinless author of sin. And you kind of mentioned infant damnation. I mean, that's kind of been making the rounds on YouTube recently with James White. I mean, if you believe everyone's totally depraved, I mean, unless you're going to have this kind of animal firm perspective, everyone's totally depraved, but some people are less totally depraved than others, so there could be elect infants and something like that. I mean, bite the bullet and say infant damnation and everyone's going to go to hell except some God's arbitrary chosen, all to give him glory. I mean, yeah.
I think this is where one of the some of the glaring inconsistencies I think in Calvin come through. I'm trying my best to read Calvin charitably. I'm doing a seminar right now, a research seminar on the Institutes with a group of 8 really outstanding students. But in his Institutes, the first book, when he talks about God having repented, and he said, well, obviously a sovereign God can't repent. So we have to read that in some other way. But a few minutes later, when God is showing any kind of devastating cruelty, well, no, that's we can't escape the literalism of the Bible. We can't escape his best defense for how we can be held accountable for actions that don't originate with us but with God is simply because that's what the Scripture says. That's the best argument he has. So absolutely faithful to a literal textual reading when God's sovereignty is at stake. But when his cruelty or injustice is at stake, no room for reinterpretation.
Yeah, I think this is one of the advantages of like, say, the Latter-day Saint hermeneutic is like we can. It's not for us both either or. It's both and.
Yeah.
Not that I think like God is kind of this Calvinistic idea, like say retributive justice, but he does have emotion. I think that this is one thing. There's actually a number of things, but this is like one thing both yourself and Fiona, I think, have done a very good job at when it comes to say the God who weeps and some of the other issues you discussed. Like if you look at the Book of Moses, and heck, just even limit yourself, like say the Bible and other texts, like God is not this kind of impassible rock in the sky or some guy who just happens to have a body and he's completely outside of time. He has no real emotion. I mean, God does have emotion in the scriptures, and it's never like this kind of play acting thing. I'll be brief. Like one of my very favorite passages in the Old Testament, and one text that convinces me of open theism is like Exodus 32 and 33, where like God in his anger when it comes to the golden calf, and this comes out in the Hebrew and Greek, it's not metaphorical or like play acting. God is heat off, he says, I'm going to destroy Israel. But Moses intercedes like a type of Christ. And what does Moses do? He appeals to God's covenantal faithfulness, his chesed, the promises he's made to the forefathers, and also based on his love for Moses, that appeases him. And it's like he changes his mind because of Moses' intercession. Or like you go to the Book of Mormon, it's like if it wasn't for Alma the senior's prayers for his son, God may not have been moved to send the angel to convert him and so forth, his son. So like God can be interacted with in our theology. God does have anger, he does have love. But like the analogy I often use is like, it's not like the imperfect love or hatred we have as humans. Like I'm sure you love your wife to death, but everyone's love for like a spouse or another loved one is like, it's always tinged, if you will, by impurity. God's emotions are not tinged, they're pure, to use metallurgical terminology here. And you kind of see this like in even some early Christians, like Lactantius, who understood God's anger at least to be real anger, which would of course mean that he's love and so forth, or is real. It's not like analogical.
Yeah.
And this would mean that God can change in some sense, ergo he's not completely outside of time. Like unfortunately, a number of Latter-day Saints do have this kind of a very classical theistic view of God's interaction with time. And just one other thing, there was a very good book that came out by Paul Helm, who's actually a Calvinist. God, I think it was called God Outside of Time, by Oxford. It's probably the best defense of divine atemporality I've ever read. He basically says like, it's only analogical you can actually use verb tenses for God's actions, like God created or God whatever. In reality, it's an eternal action that's of God, and there's no before and after when it comes to God's actions, which doesn't really make sense if we believe in the incarnation as well, even regardless of your views of.
Well, exactly. That's the problem, right? You can posit that in a creative act that right instantiates existence, but you can't posit that once Christ is in time and we're in time with God. Yeah, I just want to go back to the topic of impassibility, because this is something that I've talked about in a number of my publications, and I'm often ferociously attacked by even Latter-day Saints who say, "Oh, you don't understand impassibility." I think I understand it perfectly well, right? To be impassible means not subject to emotions that are caused from without the self, from without the divine nature. But here it seems to me is and this is maybe where my point of entry into this whole project is different, right? My training's intellectual history. I'm not a theologian. I don't pretend to be a theologian. And consequently, I'm more interested in the impact and the reception of theology than whatever kind of scholastic defenses one can make, for example, of passibility. And let me tell you how two reasons why I think that's an important approach to take to religious history. I was reading Rowan Williams' book, The Heart of Creation, right? Rowan Williams considered one of the great theologians of our day, and undoubtedly he is. But there's this very revealing moment, I think, in the book, which I found profoundly disturbing, where he's making a very protracted defense of divine impassibility. And he's talking about the Cappadocian Fathers and insisting that the Cappadocian Fathers were impassibilists. And then in a footnote, he says this. He says, of course, in his sermons and homiletics, Gregory referred to God as passible. And it's like, wait a minute. what have you just confessed here? You've just confessed that when we want to make religion real, when we want to integrate it into lived discipleship, then we have to retreat from some of these theologies that we're trying to defend with fellow theologians and use a language that means the exact opposite of what we really want to pretend we're. There just seems something perverse about that. It's been said by more than one theologian that it's not the impassible Christ that brings people to the cross. It's the suffering Christ. And so this kind of, even today, right, you find a persistent strand of contemporary theology that continues to try to defend impassibility. And I guess what I find also very remarkable about this whole problem is in the Gospel of Luke, when the resurrected Christ is on the road to Emmaus, and he's going to continue his journey. And I love the Greek, right, passage there. They don't just entreat him. It's like they're clinging. They're trying to stop him, impede him from going, and they persuade him to stay. And I think if I were trying to construct like a paradigmatic example of divine passibility, that would be it. Christ is entreated and succumbs to influences outside of himself and chooses to move in a different direction in loving response. And the fact that it's the resurrected Christ who does that seems to me to be a very emphatic point that Luke is making about it isn't just the mortal Jesus that is passible, but the eternal resurrected Christ, God the Son, is portrayed as explicitly passible as well.
Yeah, kind of disappointed to hear that about Rowan Williams. I kind of expected a bit more. Just on Williams, have you read his book on the history of Arianism?
I made a valiant effort at it. That was his doctoral dissertation that publishes his first book. Yeah.
No, very good overview of like Nicene Arianism and Arius himself. That's often overlooked, but yeah, glad you're at least heard of it. To be fair, like as an Anglican, he's bound to believe in divine impassibility because it's one of the articles of the 29 articles of the Church of England. But but I do like how you tie this back into Christology because I know you've written quite a bit on that. And yeah, I do think like say if you study Christology, that's basically the death knell to like say a lot of the impassible views. Like I know like the way to get around it is like say the hypostatic union, like in Christ, it's only one person but two distinct natures. But what you may come across, and you probably have come across this, is like functionally many of these theologians argue like Nestorians. Basically, when you ask them like, did the person of Christ know when the second coming was immortality? Yeah. They will have to say, he did, but when he said he did not in Mark and Matthew, he was only speaking from his human nature, not his divine nature. So like functional Nestorianism is going on there because you're no longer dealing with like a person, you're dealing with like impersonal natures. And if you believe in like say the Council of Chalcedon, which Protestants, Eastern Orthodox and confessional Catholic Protestants will believe in, Christ remains the God-man. He will remain like God and man in the hypostatic union for eternity because he's the eternal high priest. So that kind of creates problems. So you believe in a Trinity, but also a distinct person who has this human nature for eternity. How does that work with absolute divine simplicity? I'll let your theologians deal with that. But again, Christology, I think is, I consider Christology and consider anthropology results in, I think, a very Latter-day Saint-esque soteriology and anthropology and other issues as well when it comes to look at these kind of important issues.
Yeah, when we talk about these, the development of these two nature doctrines and their codification and Chalcedon and the Trinitarian doctrines that are codified at Nicaea, I'm reminded of both Roger Olson and Oliver Crisp, who both said very similar things, which I read with some astonishment. But in his Story of Christianity, Roger Olson says, in reference to the apostles and acknowledging there's nothing remotely like either one of those doctrines, right, in the New Testament, he'll say, well, we can't expect a bunch of itinerant fishermen to understand the Trinity. And Oliver Crisp says almost exactly the same thing in Participation and Atonement. He said, these are first century, illiterate we can't expect them to know the things, and he uses that word, to know the things we know now as 21st century theologians.
I think that's basically the abandonment of like Protestantism. At least if you're a Catholic or Eastern Orthodox, you can say the Holy Spirit guides the ecumenical councils and the bishops and the Pope in Rome to like explicate what's only in seed form in the biblical texts.
Right.
But like if you're a Protestant, you believe in basically the formal sufficiency of the 66 book canon. And also it's kind of like a functional denial that, like, say, the apostles were divinely inspired when they wrote their Christological hymns and their pastoral epistles and so forth. It's like, yeah, they may not have like understood it like intellectually, but you would imagine like God would, if you believe in the Protestant view of inspiration, would have explicated or like really strongly hinted at it throughout,
Yeah.
It's very problematic. It kind of shows like, then you don't believe this is apostolic in origin. It's a later accretion, and the real issue is like, does your church actually have the authority to actually elevate that later explication accretion to like the level of make or break when it comes to your eternal salvation? Because I don't know, I'm sure you've come across this, like even well-meaning Protestants and Catholics saying like Latter-day Saints are going to go to hell because they don't have the proper understanding of Christ and God. Even not even like, say, James White or Walter Merton, but like very well-meaning people have said that to me. It's like, hey, fair enough, you're being consistent. But really, if being consistent, you have to claim like Paul and the earliest Christians and the earliest communities were under that condemnation as well for not knowing about like
they
these
were Trinitarians.
ideas, or it's really problematic if you were to think about it, and it kind of goes against your epistemology if you believe in sola scriptura and the cessation of public revelation at the death of last apostle as well.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point.
Cool. Because I'm speaking, like, any other topic you think like has been really interesting for you to study, like you've seen like have greater precision in modern scholarship or theological circles?
Well, I'll just tell you one other topic that I'm just intrigued by and have been working with, and that is what one scholar calls the Bible's what is it called, the transmutable eschatology. And what he means by this is, there's this it's almost a humorous moment in Luke 17 when the Pharisees asked Jesus, what are the signs of the coming of the kingdom of God? And Jesus, well, it's already among you, it's in you. And then in the very next verse, he says, and these will be the signs of when it's going to come. So we get this dualistic approach, right, to the kingdom of God. And N.T. Wright struggles valiantly, right, to collapse these into just kind of one, because he's so hostile to the blue sky heaven. And I'm sympathetic to that. But the fact of the matter is that Christianity has oscillated, right, between the nowness of the kingdom, right? Rebirth happens with baptism, and the Eucharist is the bread of immortality. Resurrection begins at this moment. And the deferral of heaven into this, this second coming. And one can see this oscillation even within the Latter-day Saint tradition, right? I mean, the 1830s and 40s and 50s Latter-day Saints were, right, fervent premillennialists and apocalyptic. And all of that talk has kind of ceased, and we're much more now about, no, we can actually build Zion, and we have to build Zion before Christ comes. I think of Parley Pratt's hymn, Jesus once of humble birth, now in glory comes to earth. And sometimes we use eschatology, it seems to me, to justify a kind of sacred schadenfreude. And so I've just been interested in the way this pattern unfolds in Christian history, that no, it's about the now, the here and now, or no, it's this deferral until judgment and apocalypse. And where is our focus, and how it shifts depending on exactly what our status is in society at that moment. When all is well, we tend to be emphasizing the Zion-like quality of the body of Christ. When we're suffering waves of persecution, then we anticipate the joyful day of vengeance.
Yeah, there's a lot that kind of reminds me, like, there's been like a cottage industry amongst Latter-day Saints and others who hold like a pre-millennial perspective. Like, if a war breaks out between like two tribes in the middle of nowhere, there's like a natural disaster in Australia. Like, there's some people who will prognosticate like, oh, Christ will come around Tuesday at tea time now. But yeah, that's really interesting. And you kind of see it's like in early Christianity as well, like the reception of the little apocalypse, like Mark 13 and other texts, like how to actually make sense of this. Because there was like I think it's kind of over exaggerated, but there was a perspective in even among the apostles. I think Paul for a while believed this, that Christ would come in their lifetime. And then later Paul seemed to have realized like, no, we should live as if Christ will come today, because,
Right.
that
Right.
would be the reality if we were to die. But like, his parousia is a future event. No one will really know except God himself. But we should live our lives as if we are still in this kind of eschatology, if you will. So there's
Yeah.
an already or not yet. And I see this really reflecting like early Latter-day Saint theology, some of the speculations, the second coming, and even now where it's not as well, not as apocalyptic, but like it's still present in our theology and our worldview. I'm not sure if you've seen that as well, but that's
Oh,
my take on it.
absolutely. And one of the ironies there is that Latter-day Saints ourselves, we have completely relived, we have reenacted that the collapse of that imminent apocalypticism. When the saints gather in Missouri, and God has said, this is the place of the gathering, and they consecrate the place for the temple. And Andrew Jackson has been good enough, right, to force all of the Indians into the Indian territory so that Book of Mormon prophecy can be fulfilled about all the Lamanites being taught the gospel. And they thought, this is it, man. It's happening now. They're kicked out of Jackson County. That's okay. We're gonna get together Zion's camp, and we're going to go back and reclaim this so that Christ can come. And Zion's camp ends in this failure. And then we have this incredible revelation that comes to Joseph Smith on the banks of Fishing River. And that is probably the moment of the single greatest paradigm shift in restoration thinking, because it's that moment that the Lord tells him, well, I'm not coming. And if you want to be a sanctified people, it's not about getting into the right place. It's about going back to Kirtland and building the temple and keeping your covenants. And so I think, right, that's kind of a reenactment of what happens to the first century Christians. Zion becomes transmogrified into the idea of a covenant community rather than a locus of an actual return that is just around the corner.
Yeah, just for apologetic reasons, Joseph Smith did not say Jesus would come in 1890, 1891. I'm just going to share a link for those who will watch later, but look at my articles on this. But he did believe like he might see Christ when he was 85, but that's not the same thing as a parousia, if you will. But yeah, I do believe that's a very good approach. And I think, I'm not sure, but I think Wright is all millennial because he's an Anglican. And I think that may like color some of these perspectives when it comes to say how to understand the eschatology, because I know like in the Catholic and Eastern Orthodox tradition, because of Ephesus and Augustine, and I think the Anglicans would go with this as well. Like there's no literal millennium. Like millennium is like the church age as it's lived out now, or the saints in heaven are enjoying a literal millennium, but there will be like 1,000 years literally on this earth. I think Wright would hold that view. Though I'd like his idea, like say what heaven is. It's a marriage between earth and heaven. It's not simply disembodied spirits going off to like a different world, if you will. I like the analogy you used. Like, if your wife, or you come back from work and your wife tells you the dinner is in the oven, you don't go into the oven. It's just like it's there in the oven until it's gifted to you. And, I guess that's really helpful as well. Although, fortunately, he doesn't advocate soul sleep. So that's a good thing. So no, that's kind of good. So when it comes to like, because like I used to be a Roman Catholic and studying Catholic seminary and stuff like that, so I would kind of know a bit more than say the next person when it comes to the Catholicism and national theology. Have you actually done any studies? And if you haven't, that's fine. Just like, have you done any studies in say the development of say Mariology and other topics like that?
I have not.
Okay.
Mariology.
Okay, well, if you ever do, like, I think that would be like worthwhile. I know, like, there's a lot on your plate, but like,
the only place where I treat of that at all in my current project is, Fiona, of course, has been doing massive research on the feminine divine and in antiquity, and so I think one way, and this certainly isn't exhaustive, but one way of thinking about the growth of Mariology is as just one of many recurrent manifestations of this perennial yearning for a softer, more nurturing face of God. And I'm reminded of a really striking two pieces of art that are in Germany, in St. Jakobskirche, in I can't remember the little village in Germany. Anyhow, my wife and I were there 5 or 6 years ago. Beautiful, magnificent art from High Middle Ages, Renaissance era. And there's these dual paintings of the Last Judgment. And in one of them, hosts of the damned are being led into hell by Jesus. And in the other, throngs of the blessed are ascending to heaven, led by Mary. and that just seemed a kind of striking, kind of right again, kind of, well, manifestation, right, expression of a kind of greater confidence in the gentleness and tenderness of a feminine face of the divine than in its masculine counterpart.
Oh no, it's just like kind of curious because as I said, like I've done a lot of work over the years on Mariology and like the Bible, early Christianity, and its starring, if you will, in the medieval periods, and kind of lament like there's been like a number of very good studies in say the apostasy and restoration. I know it's kind of been a big mixed bag when it comes to say Latter-day Saint interactions, but like say Barry Bickmore and Noel Reynolds, that volume, I think they're like the better ones. And I know the early Christian text that came out by Maxwell Institute had some things, but like I never really like. I hope to write one as a monograph if and when I have time, like a good Latter-day Saint interaction with say the development of Marian devotion. That would be interesting. No, I just thought to ask that because time is fleeting, and you did say you had an hour. Like so, like usually at the end of like these type of interviews, I usually ask people like, say, what books or articles would you recommend? So, like in your studies, like in early Christianity and modern intellectual history, if you will, what sources have you found rather helpful? Because like when it comes to the early Christianity, there's like the Catholic University Fathers of the Church series, which is really good translation. There's always the Shaft set, which is now available for free online in the 19th century. But like, what other sources have you actually found to be rather useful? That if one of your students or one of your friends you were to ask, like, Dr. Givens, like, what would you recommend? Like, maybe start off with, or even for like the high level stuff, what would you recommend or you found most useful?
The two books, and they're not really introductory texts, but they're two books that have really been formative in my own ways of thinking about Christian history. One is like one of my very all-time favorite books. It's called The Vision of God by Kenneth Kirk. And one has to go onto eBay and find used copies because the reprints are all horrible abridgments. But Kenneth Kirk was a bishop of Oxford in the mid-20th century, and he writes a history of Christianity. But what immediately made him such a sympathetic writer in my eyes was that he points out that the moment the church becomes institutionalized, the moment morality becomes codified, we immediately are confronted with a problem of making ourselves, you talked about covenantal nomism, right? We immediately have this code against which we measure ourselves. And suddenly devotional life becomes very self-centered. And so for him, the quest for the face of God is the perpetual challenge of finding a way to love God without self-interest and without letting the mediation of an institutional church impede that path of discipleship. And I think that's a point of view that I think Latter-day Saints could be very sympathetic to. We need an institutional church. We need a kind of right bastion of authority, a source of authority and of the keys. But at the same time, recognizing that what he calls the beatific vision, the vision of God, is not something itself that can be mediated by the church. And so he just traces the history of this ideal from the apostolic age to the present in what I think are very beautiful ways. And then the other book I mentioned earlier, which is the one by Hastings Rashtel, The Idea of Atonement in Christian Thought, I just think it could do more to shake up some of the assumptions we inherited from the 19th century Protestantism of Joseph Smith's milieu. And I think it's provocative and needed. Not, I don't agree with everything where he comes down on atonement, but I think his critique is fresh and vigorous and thought-provoking.
yeah, there's been a lot of very good critiques of penal substitution. And I do like to see how Rashtel and that kind of school at all like holds to like a participatory model of atonement. Something you find in the writings of like the late James D.G. Dunn as well, like his work on Pauline theology. He understands like say the terminology used is not like of strict like Christ dying for us. It's not like say as a substitution. I kind of like what the
It's a tricky preposition.
yeah, it's like the proper understanding is not Christ died for us, but he did not die instead of us.
Yeah.
And once you understand that kind of nuance, it makes sense of say the participatory model of baptism, sacraments, ordinances, and sort of live participation and Christ's participation in life as well. Like that's how you make very good sense of say the baptism, theology of baptism, and our union with Christ, like he's new life in Romans 6, 3-7. And even in verse 7, it's kind of not really translated into King James properly, but it doesn't simply say we are free from sins. It actually says in the Greek, we're actually justified as a result of that union with Christ as well. So really, really good stuff. Any other recommendations? Like, do you hope to write a book on this? If so, any ETA as to when this is going to be the case?
Yeah, well, I'm over 100,000 words into it. It's proving to be a challenge to get a reading that that my Latter-day Saint affiliation does not make difficult for scholarly reviewers. I had a contract promised from one of the largest Protestant presses in America. Then somebody higher up discovered that a Mormon was writing a history of Christianity for them, and suddenly the contract was withdrawn. I had another university press very, very much interested. Actually, I have one university press now that has read the first 100 pages and have asked to see the entire manuscript. So I hope it sees the light of day someday. It's the working title is "The Love of God: A New History of Christian Thought."
Well, no, I hope it does as well. It sounds interesting, and not to sound arrogant, but like if you want anyone like to hit ideas off of, I'm free on it. So I think like Oster would be down with that as well. But yeah,
appreciate that.
Yeah. And are you working on any other projects at the moment?
I'm not. This has become all consuming. I have a couple of small things coming out, small books in the next year, but nothing major.
Oh, so and as I said, well, you've also written like a number of other books. So like maybe if we were to plug that, there's the By the Hand of Mormon, the American Scripture that Launched a Worldly Religion. I think that was the second book in Latter-day Saint studies I read. The first was like Sorensen's An Ancient American Saying, and the one after that was Quinn's Early Mormonism and Worldview. So 2 out of 3 ain't bad. There's like the 2-volume work on Latter-day Saint Theology, Resting the Angel and Feeding the Flock, very good. And you've written a number of other very good books as well, like Viper and the Hurt. Jeff Bradshaw, who's on the board of interpreters, he kind of mentioned like how he's rightfully a very huge fan of your book on the idea of pre-existence in historical thought when angels had wings. And you've written a number of other very good books as well. You mentioned like The God Who Weeps, that kind of emphasizes like the very personal God in our scriptures and theology. Of course, that's borrowed from a variant reading of Moses 7 in the JST. So yeah, everyone should totally check out Terrell's books. But like Terryl, I know you're strapped for time, so I'll let you go. But like, then thanks for coming on. It was real fun, like getting ideas off of you. I've had fun. Hopefully you had. And like, if you ever want to come on again and discuss anything, feel free to let me know. I would love to have you on again. So thanks again.
Thank you. Thanks, Rob.
Thank you. Have a great day. Well, thanks for that. And I'll let you go. But like, as I said, like if you ever want to come on again, I would love to host you. So
appreciate that. Where did you do your work?
Oh, the B.H. Roberts Foundation, if you're familiar with.
No, I mean your schooling.
Oh, sorry, the Pontifical University in Maynooth. I got degrees in anthropology and theology there.
Great. All right. Well, look forward to talking to you again.
Oh, sure. Take care. Okay, guys. I'm still live, so any questions you want to ask me, what did you think of that? Do you want me to make the episodes live streams all the time? Like the one I have with Jeff Lindsay on Book of Mormon Evidences and Tark the Core on the A and B theories of time, like in February. So just let me know. And if you have any questions or comments, especially super chats, because let me know. If not, I'll just end because I have to go back home. Let's see from the YGDS. No questions, just a very good discussion. Thanks, dude. I really appreciate it. It was real fun. But I wish he could go on for like longer than 1 hour. But like, I'm friends with his son Nathaniel, who, by the way, I hope to have on sometime this year again to finish our abortion discussion. But until then, yeah, it was real fun having Terryl Givens of all people on. But yeah, hopefully we can actually have him on again later in the year to discuss like other topics like these 2 volumes on Latter-day Saint history. Much better than a certain book that came out in 2010 on the topic, Charles Harrell's. Okay, Clayton, $5. Thanks, dude. I really appreciate it. Big fan of the live stream format. Yeah, what I'll do is like I'll probably consider doing live streams a bit more regularly now, so that the money issue has been fixed with YouTube. As you guys probably know, not American, but had some tax wrangling issues when it came to YouTube, but that's been fixed. And yeah, would be nice to actually earn some pocket money, just for like say maybe additional books, because he mentioned 1 or 2 books which I ordered while listening to him talk. So yeah, thanks again, Clayton. And by the way, Summer J, as I said on the chat, I'll reach out to Kevin Christensen because he's done work from a pro Margaret Barker, con King Josiah perspective. I'll see if there's any other Latter-day Saint who would take a different perspective, and we could have like say 2 episodes back to back. But what I'll do is I'll also on my YouTube channel have a call out for like Catholics, regards to their perspective on Josiah and Barker, to like maybe give their perspective from a Catholic POV on the Deuteronomistic reforms. So could actually get 3 good episodes out of that, and maybe 4 if we had a roundtable of pro and con Barker / King Josiah perspectives. So yeah, I'll drop an email to Kevin Christensen before I leave. Brent, a real enjoyable still BB0. No idea what that means, Brent, but thanks for the comment. Okay, I'll end things maybe like 5 minutes, but just a reminder on Sunday, I think about 5 p.m. my time, Travis Anderson will be joining me, and I think Sarah Allen will be joining me as well. Travis has some comments for and against Jacob Hansen's recent video, so that'll be interesting. By the way, I'm friends with Jacob, so it's not gonna be like a bash the guy, but Travis has some issues, so that'll be interesting. And of course, we'll have a dank meme review, so be on the outlook for that about 5 p.m. Mountain Standard Time. Let's see. Oh, thanks for the super chat, even if you use fake Canadian money. Live streams are a very good format for this type of discussion. You actually ask insightful questions, like some other podcasters. I think I know who you're talking about. Keep up the good work. Yeah, thanks, dude. I really appreciate it. Oh, and by the way, if you guys ever want me to like invite anyone on, or if you think yourself capable of discussing a particular topic, when it comes to that maybe relevancy to like either Latter-day Saints and specifically, or even just theology or history or whatever in general, hit me out at scripturalmormonism@gmail.com. You don't even have to be LDS. I've hosted non-LDS on who know their stuff. So that would be good. And even non-mainstream LDS, like my friend Adam Clark. No, not Adam Clark. That's the biblical commentator. Adam Stokes. Sorry, I'm tired. Adam Stokes. Who, by the way, will be coming on to discuss the historical interpretation of the book of Job. And we will have parts 3 and 4 of our modalism debate, focusing on the Hebrew and Greek New Testament texts sometime this year as well. So be on the outlook for that. But thanks again for the super chats, dudes. I really appreciate it. Okay, so any other comments or any other comments you want to make about the episode or any other suggestions before I head off for my walk back home. By the way, if you're not subscribed, hit that subscribe button. It helps with the algorithm. And be sure to join membership because I like money. I don't know how to get that one out. But yeah, smash that like button. So before I end, any other final comments or questions before I end? And it can be on anything if you want to ask me anything as well. Okay, well, silence. Still, like some people are still watching this. How many people are still watching this? Okay, 18 people still watching. So yeah, fair dues. So if you guys have any questions, you direct them my way. Let me know. If not, I'll end it in like the next 5 minutes. But again, like we hit 1,500 subscribers. Huzzah. So we're having a Dank meme review Sunday at 5 p.m. Although the first part of it will be Travis Anderson and interacting with my friend Jacob Hansen's video, which I think a number of people have seen. It's linked in the channel for the live stream. Yeah, so Sunday, 5 p.m. It's the one with the Dan McClellan meme as the picture for it. Okay, well, there's no other comments, so like I will end things here. But like, thanks for coming out to the live stream. What I will do is I'll actually make most of the episodes as live streams from now on. That way, you guys maybe ask questions I don't think of when I interview or interact with, say, Jeff Lindsay over the next few weeks and Turk the Core. By the way, I will also have what's his name? First Vision guy. Stephen Harper. Jeez, I'm tired. I will actually have Stephen Harper on later this year. So we'll be discussing, I don't know what we'll discuss, maybe First Vision, maybe some other topic. I've also emailed Blake Oster. I want him to like maybe discuss the nature of infinity and the idea like there's such things in the infinite past and so forth, like some of the very in-depth philosophical ideas that even make my brain fried at times to understand and maybe make it a bit more simplified. That'll be a fun episode, even if it's going to be a bit esoteric. And we do have like Turk the Core on, like he'll be coming on the 20th of February, which I believe is a Tuesday. He'll be discussing the A and B theories of time. He'll be giving a general overview of their pros and cons. I hope to actually have Turk on regularly this year to like maybe give an introduction to philosophy, because Turk's a very smart guy. And I say this as someone who completely disagrees with Turk on everything. If you know anything about myself and Turk, I'm an open theist. I hope to libertarian free will. He's a compatibilist and he's a determinist and he holds the penal substitution. So, but we're still friends. Another comment, no question right now, but knowing you will do more live streams, me a lot start compiling list. Oh, that's brilliant. Make a compilation, like say recommended guests. As long as they know their stuff and they can interact with, like say, at least the softball questions people will ask, and they don't have to be LDS. I mean, I'll actually put this out now. If there's an informed Roman Catholic who wants to give an overview of why one should be a Catholic, and the same when it comes to an Eastern Orthodox or a confessional Lutheran, by all means. I've had like a Christa Delphine on. I've had some members of non-LDS restorationist groups on, giving an overview of their theology and history. So, you know, if someone knows who Peter Williams, the British Catholic, I would love to have him on to for him to give a overview of like Catholicism and a case for it, you know, in a friendly setting. So, yeah. So, okay, well, again, guys, thanks for coming on. And if Terryl actually watches this, thanks again for coming on, Dr. Gibbons. I hopefully will have him on again later this year because that was a fun discussion. It was way too short. But again, live stream on Sunday. So yeah, and hit that subscribe button, that like button, and share this video as well. So until then, hopefully catch you guys on Sunday, and hopefully again for the next live stream, whenever that will be after the one on Sunday. I'll email Jeff Lindsay again before I leave the office to arrange something. And it will be on Book of Mormon evidences, like a presentation of some of her favorite evidences for the Book of Mormon. No doubt there will be some overlap. He'll discuss like Bountiful and Nahum. I'll be discussing some linguistic issues I've discussed before, Mulek and other topics as well, and maybe interact with some of the common objections from the likes of Vogel and others. So yeah. Oh yeah, thanks. The Gids. I'm probably butchering your name, but yeah, have a good night yourself and have a good night everyone else as well. Until then, live on and prosper.